Thank you. Very interesting conversation. In your research, did you run across any commentary about the influence that the Roman Empire had on Columbus? The empire had disintegrated by then, but do you have any sense of how that influenced how he thought?
Yeah, there is an interesting book that I read on the iterations of the Columbus story and the Columbus myth, and in the 16th century, starting when Columbus was still alive, but then after his death, a number of writers compared him to Aeneas from Virgil's Aeneas from the Iliad. So he was the Roman myth, he was the mythical figure, establisher of the Roman Empire, and that whole idea of the movement of empire from east to west, which was in the Virgilian myth of the Virgil's poetry epic poetry about Rome. That idea was then kind of transferred to Columbus. So Columbus became like this new Aeneas in the European imagination. So yes, he was. I mean, Rome is always, if we ever talk about empire in the Western, world, Rome is always the leitmotif, right? And so Columbus as a kind of a new Roman, a new Aeneas. It's not surprising that would happen, but he was really, of all the explorers of that period, he was the one who was most associated with that.
Thank you. Took me a second to raise my hand because I was trying to phrase my question in my head, and I don't know if I was done. So excuse me, I think out loud. Recently when I mentioned this event, something that I heard in response was, well, there were good people and there were bad people that came on the boats and, or the ship. And the defense, what I was hearing was they sent him because they really didn't believe him. They sent him with a bunch of, people that are prisoners. And so, whether what they were saying was true or not, it was the idea that the prisoners were the bad ones and they were the ones doing all the bad things. And Christopher Columbus was just the sailor. And so I don't know if you have any response to that, or any thoughts about that, like, because I liked what you said about, it was the idea in general about, you're discovering what is not Christian, which I think that's where I would grab on to that response, or to that comment. But what would you respond to that again?
So, I mean, Columbus himself, again, I talked about his PR skills but Columbus himself made that argument. So that idea goes back to Columbus himself, right? He made the argument that all the bad stuff that happened, he blamed it on other people. Wasn't my fault. It was it was these right lowlifes who were sent there by the Spanish and so on, and I couldn't control them and this and that, right? So to me, this is less important in a way. The question, like, let's say everybody on that expedition were just model citizens, all right? And they still took this native land anyway, right? Because that's what they were there to do, right? And let's say they were really kind of nice about it, or, however that's possible, right? But, it was an imperial enterprise, right? And so, you hear there are similar debates in the United States about how the expulsion of native tribes took place, and who is to blame for the Trail of Tears, and so on, all that, and those are all, I think, important. Those are important historical, issues to examine. But the fact is, at the end of the day, their land was taken from them without their consent, and they were here first. And how is that justified, right? And they're really, the only way to justify it is to say that we are a superior people. We took it because we were Christians and they were heathens, or we're, smarter and they're stupider, or whatever the argument is, right? That it's always, as I said, that's when any invader uses that kind of rhetoric. We are invading not because we're rapacious, greedy assholes, but because we are a superior people and we're going to make life better for those poor folks that we're taking the land away from, right? Russia and Ukraine, right? Russia uses the same rhetoric to invade Ukraine. I mean, it's a playbook. We know it's a playbook that goes back for millennia. So to me, that question is less, and I don't know the answer to that question, but it's less important to me than the larger question about how our nation is built on a fundamental act of taking another people's land without their consent. And that's called settler colonialism, right? And that's what this nation is founded on.
Hi, Dr. Savage. I had a question. Thank you for being here and for sharing your research with us. So my question's a pretty simple one, and that is, how do we talk about monuments if we're encountering them in the public? How do we have a conversation with children or our parents or our friends or people that we might be out in the public space with when we encounter a monument, specifically if it's of a challenging or complex subject?
That's a good question. I have a colleague at the University of Pittsburgh who has become now a real expert in interpreting monuments for children, particularly monuments that are traumatic, to traumatic subjects, like 9/11 monuments or whatever. Because this has not been thought about, generally speaking. This has not been thought about. Like, we have a lot of monuments to really that deal with really horrific events. And I was just at last fall, I was in Oklahoma, and I went to the memorial to the victims of the bombing in Oklahoma City, and I just thought, how can a child really deal with this? I mean, I could barely deal with it, right? So I think it is really difficult. Particularly, kids don't have a context for thinking about things like, people coming and stealing your land, right? Like, and you're going to for the first time, put in their head that somebody might come and take your house away from you, or something like, you can't imagine the way that kids might spin this kind of stuff out in their own minds, So I think it is a really challenging thing to talk honestly about history. It's challenging for anybody, right? It's challenging for adults to talk honestly about history. Like, a lot of people just don't want to hear certain things. And then, making that part of a family conversation becomes more challenging. And of course, it depends on your perspective. Like, are you the victim or the victimizer? Then, those are two real different positions. to be in. And if in some ways, if you're the victim, it's in many ways easier to talk. I think it's easier to have this because it's part of their reality. It's already part of their reality. Whereas for people who are victimizers, it's not, it's not part of their reality, and they don't see it that way.
This question may not go exactly to the crux of your talk, but towards the very end, you made it very curious for me. You talked about some of the early sculptures that involve Native Americans and how negative, that they're portrayed. So it made me think about something most people probably can't even see. On the very top of the Capitol Rotunda, my understanding is it's a statue of a Native American. And do you know what the symbolism? Because it's right atop of our U.S. Capitol.
Yeah. So, that's another one of these weird figures. It has a kind of Indian headdress on it, but it's also it's supposedly a figure of liberty, right? So it's a mishmash of kind of symbols. And not only that, but it was made by the sculptor who made it was, a Confederate sympathizer and an enslaver, and it was an enslaved, one of the workforce, one of the most important people in the workforce, the skilled bronze caster was an enslaved person who helped to make that figure of liberty. So it's a very weird. I've never understood what the deal was with the Indian headdress actually on that. Even though I've studied that sculptor, I don't know why he did it or what he meant by it.
Thank you so much. So I have a few thoughts, and it will end in a question mark. Thinking about how monuments relate to time and place, they're either ephemeral or permanent fixation representing something that happened in the past, while now we're sort of facing our current homeland situation on this planet where everything that is discoverable has been, all the land. And so now all we have left is the future and maybe space. So when we're thinking about colonization now, are you hearing conversations about like climate and the future and the conditions of our planet being colonized by the use of resources? And then how do we commemorate something that may not be livable if we don't learn how to live sustainably? And then at that point, the entire earth almost, could you see it being a monument to humanity and the civilization that we've striven to conquer, but in doing so destroyed itself if we don't, make some really systematic and deep changes?
Right. Well, certainly if we do reach that dystopian future, it would be a monument to, the failure of civilization, right? If we reach that, we've got a couple of random things to respond to that. I was out in Oklahoma in the fall, and it was the first time I saw the memorial, the traumatic memorial to the bombing victims, but also the Capitol building in front of the Capitol building directly on axis with the entrance to the Oklahoma State Capitol is a huge oil rig that is a monument to the oil industry, right? And to extraction. And the whole building, so just like the National Capitol is filled with Columbus imagery, the whole building in Oklahoma is filled with imagery of extraction and frontier stuff. So like there's a painting called The Magic of Petroleum. Giant painting. It is an oil painting, yes. But not petroleum. And so there are places where, this would be an interesting thing to study, would be the ways in which kind of extraction or the idea of extractive industry is literally memorialized, in this country. And I think we would find a lot more of it if we looked for it. So as far as the future and telling a new story, I mean, I sort of glanced at that at the end of my paper, because, one of the things that kind of really, a fact that kind of really blew me away, that I should have known but didn't. And it's actually one of my fellow board members on Monument Lab who deals with climate change issues as part of his job. And he made a podcast in which he said that most of the biodiversity on the planet is still stewarded by indigenous. I mean, today, I'm talking about today, is stewarded by indigenous peoples. And so indigenous peoples are playing now, and right in the present, a crucially important role in protecting the planet from climate catastrophe. And how many of us understand or realize that? Like, I had not realized that. It's really kind of obvious when you start thinking about places like the Amazon and so on, who are the people who are stewarding these resources? And it's indigenous people. So far from having disappeared or become irrelevant, they're more, that is more relevant than ever. And so, but how do we tell that, how do we start telling those stories? Like, if we told the stories of the people who have been there forever stewarding this precious biodiversity that is keeping the planet life on the planet from collapsing right now. If we started telling those stories instead of putting oil rigs, as monuments, we would have a very, then we would have, like, kids would be seeing that, right? They would be seeing those stories instead of oil rigs or, Confederate heroes or whatever, So, but how do we do that? That's not the way monuments tend to be built, right? They tend to be built by private interest groups that are doing it to support whatever their own cause. And so those are not, people in the Amazon.
Hi, I was curious about the use of Columbus in the Confederacy or post-Confederacy, the lost cause narrative or the Daughters of the Confederacy, if he was used at all in their sort of catalog of monuments, or just in general, pulling those two threads together.
That's a great question. And I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I don't have a good answer to that question. That's a really, really interesting question. I can think of some examples of sculptors who did both. Moses Ezekiel, for example, he did a lot of Confederate monuments, also did some Columbus monuments. So there likely is a crossover there, but I have not really investigated it. And you've given me something to think about investigating, because of course in the South, in the states that became the Confederacy, this was the epicenter of Indian removal, right? This is where the Cherokees and the Creeks, and they were in the southern states, and the primary motivation behind expelling them was to open up the land for cotton cultivation. So from the beginning, slavery and native dispossession are tied together. And so you could see a way in which Columbus, could be tied in really well. And then, of course, the examples I gave you of the naming, they were examples in the Southeast and in native areas. But, the thing is, when Italian American communities take on Columbus, then it takes on a different character. but I would really, it would be interesting to know more about like the UDC. Did the UDC do anything with Columbus? And I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting about the Reimagining Columbus conversation is the broad range of possibilities for what comes next for the statue and for beyond just like it's taken down forever and never spoken of again, or just simply replaced with something else altogether, right? So, everything's kind of still on the table being discussed and all that. But I'm just curious if you have examples of other places that are doing this kind of interesting or have done this really sort of interesting, like, reimagining altogether or recontextualizing of monuments, or like something that's like an example that we could point to of like what this could become. I just don't know of anything personally.
Yeah, I don't know of a lot myself. I was studying Charlottesville's process before 2017 because Charlottesville went through this, went through a really deep engagement with local communities there in trying to figure out what to do with their Confederate monuments. And they addressed all these same questions, like the question of recontextualization, the issue of is there a way to, recontextualize this that in any way competes with, is as powerful as the monument itself. Like, you can't just put a plaque down somewhere and say, we don't like this monument, but the monument is still up and is still this giant presence in your community. And it's still, it's still maintained and it's still honorific and it's still adjacent to a lot of really honorific things like your, statue right in front of the building, and the classical architecture reinforces the statue and the statue reinforces the classical architecture, all of that, right? So just putting a plaque down is not going to is not going to change much of anything. So for example, in Charlottesville, they talked about a lot more dramatic interventions, like putting a huge chain link fence around the monument and having people put their own reactions or put, kinds of historical documents and things like that around that really countered the monument in a really effective way. People, of course, have talked about, you can build other things, counter monuments to them, which are equally dramatic, equally, that have a similar scale and power to them. But that's also extremely expensive, and you have to get people to agree on it, what it's going to be, which is really impossible. And so I think we probably have to use a variety of things. I think some things need to come down, and there are all kinds of things that can be done with them if they're brought down. They don't have to be just hidden away and we don't talk about them anymore. I'm very frustrated by that. That frustrates me. I mean, we took down a monument in Pittsburgh to Stephen Foster that had a really demeaning representation of African American included in the monument. And so, obviously it shouldn't be up. But then, it's just been put away in storage and we don't talk about it. We don't talk about why it was ever there in the first place and the harm that it had and what might be, how do we heal from that? Like, you don't heal from something by pretending that it never happened. Right? So, I just think we need a lot of creative thinking about that healing process and about the reparation process. And everything should be on the table, in my view, and we'll see. And that's, I think, one reason why we're looking to your project, because you are actually, taking that on.
All right. Yeah, this is a variation actually of the same question. You had said earlier that there were the 3 statues on the steps of the Capitol, and one of them, I think you said, still exists, but it was moved inside another building. And I'm wondering how it's displayed or portrayed inside that building.
Yeah, so it's I have not seen it super recently. So when I last saw it, it's first of all, it's really large. So you have to find a space for it, which is always a problem with when you take a monument down and people say, well, put it in a museum. It's not so simple, right? Partly because of the scale, and partly because then the museum has to take care of it, and that costs money. But what happened there was they put it into the National Museum of American History on the mall, and down in the basement level. And so in a large open space, because it is a huge thing that it's a over life size, colossal statue of Washington seated. Like even seated, he towers above you. But it's really kind of neat to have it there because you can actually go around. You can see those little figures of Columbus and the warrior, behind, because you can get really close to it and look at it really carefully. So that's another thing that's so interesting about taking monuments down, is that, like, especially if you take them off a high pedestal and put them down at ground level, you can actually look at them. You can actually see them, like, for the first time. You can really see them. And that was done, to give another example, that was done with the Jefferson Davis monument in Austin, Texas. Statue was taken down from the pedestal, and then it was conserved and refurbished. Just cost like $500,000 to do, right? And then it was put into the History Museum of the university's history, the Briscoe Center there, and in a glass case with a bunch of other stuff. So you come by and you're actually like, he's right there in front of you. Like, he's not up anymore. He's right in front of you.
And is there any explanation of why it was taken down?
I don't think so. When I saw it, there wasn't. So that statue of Washington was moved several times. It was never well liked because he was nude from the waist up. Okay, and he was presented like a kind of Roman emperor, actually. And so people didn't like the nudity. They made merciless fun of it. He had a cloak over his shoulder that was supposed to be like a piece of Roman drapery or something. And people would say things like Washington coming out of the bath, or anyway, it was the most ridiculed. It's still probably the most ridiculed statue in the history of the United States. So it was moved to the Smithsonian, the Castle, in 1908, and then it was moved to the History Museum in 1964. And, most people knew the story of it when it was moved initially. And now it's kind of like people don't really know what it is anymore.
Recently, they talk about the figures and then.
Oh,
I don't think they tell that whole story.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's new because that wasn't there when I saw it. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the other two that were moved in 1958 do you know anything about the background of why they were moved?
Yeah. Well, okay. So what happened in 1958 was that the east front of the Capitol was restored and the steps were redone. And so that was kind of the moment. That was the excuse. Okay, we have to take them down as part of this renovation project. And then they just never came back. But there had been, as I said, a history of complaints about them, particularly from Native American officials who had come to Washington to lobby, or to be involved in congressional legislation or committee work. And they had to walk by these things, and they're just super racist, super demeaning, right? So, so I think that was probably the real reason. And then they have never been seen since. They were put in storage, and the story is that one of them was dropped by the crane, and so it may be completely destroyed. I think it's in fragments. The sculpture curator at the National Museum of American, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, was talking about putting some of the fragments back on display for a while for a temporary exhibition, but even that didn't happen.